Thank you very much, for that. Unlike Kathleen, I had no anxieties whatsoever. I felt serenely convinced, Kathleen, that I would entirely agree with whatever you argued because you would do it as you did so persuasively. And I was also smugly aware that you would set up wonderful, complex questions about Duff Gordon in ways that make my life so much easier. So a lot of my paper would be like, you know that fascinating thing Kathleen was saying? Here's another thing about boats that I'd like you to think about in relation to that. So this is sort of the approach today, which I, for one, am fine with, I must say. We'll just get my stopwatch and we're good to go. Now, for the first bit of today's paper, I'm just going to very briefly sort of set out my own particular, Kathleen's already sort of set up Duff Gordon herself and the complexity of her texts and her experiences of Egypt. I'm just going to briefly sort of set up for you my own interest in Duff Gordon or the sort of frameworks through which I'm approaching today's topic. That my interest lies in the sort of epistemological encounters her letters set up between her and the socio-political urban and rural worlds of 1860s Egypt, and what happens when we locate these textual encounters in the context of bodily illness and physical mobility. In other words, the lived realities of the body in space, whether that space be colonial or not. And I think the thing I'd particularly flag up is the extent to which Duff Gordon in her letters seeks to sort of carve out, I would argue, a model of a sort of epistemological authority in which her own subjective experience of Egypt allows her a distinctive knowledge that in essence transcends the established patterns of European discourse. So, as she writes to her husband towards the end of her life, I honestly believe that knowledge will die with me which few possess. The learned know books and I know men, and what is still more difficult, women. So again, there's clearly a distinction here between the learned who might, read or know about scholarship of Egypt and her lived real experience. And this sort of motif, as we'll see, recurs at multiple moments, as we'll see here, and Duff Gordon in particular places considerable emphasis in her letters on her rejection of both religious and racial binaries. East and West is the difference, not Muslim and Christian. So even as she engages in kind of classic colonial rhetoric, of course the Arabs, want governing with a strong hand, like all ignorant, childish creatures. But I'm fully convinced that custom and education are the only real differences, and inner nature is the same all the world over. And in this, then, we see Duff Gordon positioning herself insistently in this claim on her individual experiential authority, positioning herself in contradistinction, then, to the other potential claimants on her territory, literal and figurative, of 19th century Egypt, particularly, of course, as you know, was her relative, Harriet Martineau. And you can see here various engagements with various writers on Egypt and India, in the case of Eden, and Duff Gordon's sense of herself as possessing a certain type of privileged epistemological authority. But my paper today, the thing I'm particularly interested in us thinking about, is in a very specific context, the mobility dynamics of Duff Gordon's travels on the Nile. In other words, thinking about the paper today and thinking about the Nile as the prompt, as it were, for the conference, I started thinking about the processes whereby, when she leaves her lovely house in Luxor and starts traveling up and down the river, how does she do this? I started thinking more carefully, how does she talk about those processes, and particularly the vessels and the people and the labor through which these travels are being facilitated. So that's going to be what we're thinking of. And so I want to think here, in a sense, about illness and the travelling body, about the way in which the Duff Gordon's sort of the body, Duff Gordon's body is sort of being, in a sense, brought into these points of epistemological authority by a set of both economic and social and labour processes, which both feature in her text in certain ways, and yet in others, as I'm going to argue, the text works to in many ways elide the physical and commercial realities of mobility, of what it might take to make the travelling body, particularly the travelling ill body, the travelling not well body, be able to lay these claims to intense epistemological authority. So in talking about, for the first part of the letters in Egypt, she's frequently discussing a number of different modes of travel, but the ones that often will come up are modes of steamers, or the early versions of Nile steamships. And in these then, we can see the Nile steamships as offering a sort of fascinating models of sort of complex shifting power dynamics, the extent to which the steamers here, for example, are still under the potential control as valuable assets of Ismail Pasha, the ruler of Egypt, and therefore Duff Gordon's own travels can be compromised, changed, preempted by the demands of the loosely defined Egyptian state. But we also see that Duff Gordon's privileged position as a European woman of not wealth, perhaps she would not see herself as wealthy, but certainly relative wealth within this context and privilege, allows her, once she's able to sort of finally arrive at the boat, so her servant can't move her baggage on, but once she arrives, her baggage gets moved on. And then, in a kind of claiming of the dynamics of the Eastern woman, she claims the rhetoric of the harem, or the harem. Once installed, this has become a harem, and I may defy the Turkish effendi, the person who's been shipped up to the pasha, with success. So there's a sense in which she's kind of claiming, if you like, the benefits, so to speak, of Eastern womanhood, even as what she's in fact exercising here, of course, is the privileged positionality of herself as a white European traveller. And even as their journeys proceed, she sort of in many ways celebrates the world of the steamers, these little flock of steamers going up the fleet, I know, but here she thinks of them as a flock, going up and down the Nile. And she sees this world as creating this kind of fascinating transnational community. See what strange combinations of people float on old Nile, as she says. I do like to get the title in early, so people like to know where it's coming. You know, 2 English women, that would be herself and of course Sally, 1 French man, Turks, Arabs, Negroes, Circassians. Incidentally, I think that number difference is interesting. The English women and the French man and woman get distinguished, but then when we shift into more Eastern races, suddenly with the numbers, both probably because many of these are crew, but also the numbers, they become more indistinguishable, don't they? Turks, Arabs, Negroes, Circassians, and men from Darfur, all in one party. Perhaps the third boat contains some strange other element. But as the kind of power struggles over claiming her space on the boat suggest, and there's a number of reasons why the world of the Nile steamers isn't really congenial to the privileged claims to epistemological authority that Duff Gordon is seeking to make here. So, and of course, this advertisement from Thomas Cook's steamship flotillas comes, of course, as Catherine was saying, from a bit later in the century, when the idea of the Nile steamers had become, as you see, an established part of the popular tourist culture. But of course, even this reminds us of some of the sense of distaste that Duff Gordon starts to feel about the supposedly wonderful transnational communities of the steamers, a sense of the steamers as both physically dirty and messy and unpleasant, but also as kind of psychologically messy and unpleasant, socially discomfortable. So writing to her mother, we had a wretched voyage, good weather, but such a I should try to pronounce that, of a ship. I am competent to describe the horrors of the Middle Passage, hunger, suffocation, dirt, and such canaille high and low on board. And that's, of course, contemptuous reference to the sort of people she's coming around with. And obviously there's a passage here that we need to come back to. Now, after a summer of Oppenheimer jokes, perhaps we should not be too judgy about the black humour of the past. Obviously, Duff Gordon's claim to epistemological knowledge of the Middle Passage is obviously a throwaway, ironic moment. But it is, nevertheless, a sort of unsettling moment, a moment where her voluntary physical and social discomfort is being translated, however ironically, into epistemological knowledge of the ultimate in the horrors of transatlantic slavery, in the ultimate positioning of the body without agency, the body as solely a provider of labour on a ship. So it's a throwaway moment, but it is, I think, rhetorically a disturbing one, the way in which those different types of experiences of the world of the ship are being uncomfortably elided. Turning then from the world of the steamer, we see increasingly in her letters a wistfulness for the Dahabiya, and I was scribbling frantically, Betty, every time you said it to make sure I was guessing there's something like how you were saying it sounded plausible to me. So I'm not convinced. No, you sounded right. I was definitely. Anyway, let's hope for that. And she speaks wistfully at various intervals, both of trying to hire one and also, as we see, the possibility of what the Dahabiya might offer her. And what it offers her, this sort of much old, in a sense, this is a sort of already slightly retro nostalgia. I mean, these were sort of wooden or sailing houseboats. They were very common. There were still loads of them around, as we see. But already, as the presence of steamers suggests, this is very much a sort of retrospective, a more retro type of transport on the Nile. And what it clearly offers her is in essence an aestheticized Nile experience, the Nile sublime, and this really beautiful passage, the silence of noon with the white heat glowing on the river which flowed like liquid tin, and the silent Nubian rough boats floating down without a ripple was magnificent and really awful. The sight of and that's awful in the sort of sublime sense, or the sight of the overflowing Nile is said to be magnificent. It is all over the land and 8 miles of the railway gone. Now, crucial as Nile's flooding is, of course, first of all, Nile's flooding is, of course, a crucial part of the ecology of Egyptian agriculture in the region. But also, the flooding of the Nile is nevertheless not an easy or simple thing for the people living in those communities. The very fact that entire transport networks are being visibly wiped out in this moment. So it's, again, an aestheticized vision that can afford to overlook some of the sort of commercial and economic realities. I will say, of course, again, keep saying Duff Gordon's a complex figure. As Kathleen pointed out, she's just come out of doing a lot of very difficult medical work in conditions. So as she says, I really wanted to forget all the sickness and sorrow in which I've taken part. Her desire for an aestheticized Nile, a sublime experience, in a way you can see is an individually earned one. She isn't unaware of the horrors of the people, the Egyptian people have been undergoing, but she can afford to turn away, to aspire to this possibility, this possible world of the Dahabiya. She is, however, prevented initially from getting one, and here is where, alas, those commercial realities kick in. That all, and you can see here, Duff Gordon, in theory, is of course pleased that the various Egyptian workers are getting better pay at the moment, but the enormous rise of wages, which, however, falls heavy on the rich. Again, we can see a certain irony here, but nevertheless, certain social media pronouncements in recent days by employers might have a certain resonance here. So I fear I must give up my project. And here we see briefly then the Dahabiya being sort of presented as a tourist thing. The travellers, gay Dahabiya is just as usual, the Europeans as far removed from all care or knowledge of the distresses as if they were at home. So she's looking at these probably more wealthy tourists able to sail up and down the Nile and sort of seeing them as cut away from her bleak epistemological knowledge of the suffering and death that's been all around her. When I go sit with the English, I feel almost as if they were foreigners to me too. So completely am I now also of the country here. So there's a sense there in which she's kind of wrestling with what this type of ship might mean to her. So let's think for a moment about what this type of space, what it might offer someone in Duff Gordon's position. I realized instantly that deciding to read off my computer instead of a printout was a terrible idea. My brain cannot cope with doing 2 computer things. I hadn't realized this. I keep hitting the wrong forward. It's very embarrassing. I should have stuck with paper. Anyway, however, once I've remembered what I'm doing, let us find the mouse and you can see here certain 19th century pictures of these ships, which you see quite popular. What they offered was not an isolated experience, because of course they still required a crew and they required physical labour. The labour of sailing, the labour of the ships themselves. So Duff Gordon will have to get a crew. But they offer her, obviously, a sense of, if she possesses one of these, she'll have a far greater individual sort of, she'll have a far greater sense of isolated agency. No longer will the forces of the state be able to commandeer her mode of transport. So it gives her then this sense of sort of isolated capacity for mobility that is much harder to take away from her than on something like the communal communities of the steamers, which are subject to far bigger transactions. It is, though, worth noting, perhaps, and when looking up images for this slideshow, I just happily typed the word in, going, assuming all the hits would be 19th century. I had to really work at finding 19th century ones, because as you'll see, these ships still clearly occupy this role as symbols of the retrospective, nostalgic Nile cruise. So these are all modern versions of the classic Nile cruise experience, still, as you'll see, being very heavily marketed to tourists and being used here in Wilkinson's book as the symbol of this is what it means to go downriver, down the Nile. So then we come, of course, 1865, and the arrival of, thanks to her daughter, of her very own sailing ship. And she anticipates this gleefully, and finally, after much discussion and a certain amount of work on it, is able to claim the ship, which will be known as the Darling Bride, and be able to claim it then as her ship, as her new mode of transport and mobility of down and around the Nile. And part of what I want to trace out in these journeys, and I've got 5 minutes left, I think, so I'm going to skip over some of this middle bit relatively quickly. But what I want to convey is the curiousness of what these journeys and what the world that this possession of the ship opens out to her. So as you'll see just in these extracts, she travels down the Nile, and almost everywhere she goes, she's welcomed into various communities. So she's invited into, for example, a set of rituals that she would normally, a woman, and certainly not a European woman, she makes clear, would ever be invited to. But no one seemed offended or even surprised. I suppose my face is so well known at Kenna. And then next morning, with the first good wind, and bowled up to Luxor in one day, arriving just after sunset, instantly the boat was filled. So every time where she goes, she's met by an admiring, loving community. A community is familiar, that greets her, that welcomes her, and I went back to bed in my own boat. So it's a community that she can be part of, and yet also, thanks to the boat, in essence, detach herself from, always be able to, as it were, have her epistemological cake and eat it, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I think it's kind of fascinating, this that sense of this journey, that the Dahabiya is a sort of epistemological vessel in which she is mobile, yet always at home, and she is perpetually transient, yet never out of place. And this then is the world that this ship offers her. And this one to begin. It also offers, though, the possibility of staging her ship and by extension to herself, the community she builds, as a kind of space of domesticity. And she positions herself here, as she does so often, in a quasi-maternal role. Lads of most respectable families of Luxor have come to ask hospitality. The respectability of being under my eyes. They come and they sit on the deck and they dip bread with her. So she's opened up this hospitable space in which they chatted with me on perfectly equal terms. So though they are men, they will chat with her on equal terms as a woman. Though she is white and European, she will chat with them on equal terms, even though they're Egyptian. The only distinction is the respect proper to my age. Duff Gordon is, of course, at this point, very ill, but she is nevertheless only about her mid-40s. But it's very insistent, and we saw this a couple of times, Kathleen, in your wonderful reading of the Sheikh Mohammed Kiss, the anxiety to cast herself in a motherly role, with the bodies of Egyptian men being positioned, in essence, as the bodies of children, and that therefore that kind of authorizes her to keep her space as this soothing. It justifies her travels, and it justifies Dahabiya as a domestic space, which of course is probably why, among other things, it was so unsettling to her what took place between Omar and Sally. And I realized with great annoyance, Kathleen, that I was checking the dates, and I think probably the boat berth may have happened to be. Couldn't quite work out if it was on her actual one or not, so I'm going to have to double check that. But symbolically or otherwise, you can see then the sense that the space of the ship has been sort of polluted or corrupted by this concept of adult sexuality. Because after all, so much of her rhetoric has been so careful. And you'll see this here in this letter to her husband, who talking about the work done on the ship, the various expansions, which you will note have added some space so that Omar has not to come through to the saloon to sleep, even as she offers her husband a bed in her newly reconstructed ship. There was beds long enough even for you. So there's an implicit sort of reassurance there, even as it engages. There's also something the ship presents, the uneasy intimacy of shipboard space, that even her harem space is necessarily small, contained, and inevitably neat. And I'm on my final minute, so I'm going to jump in again. To think to the final passage I want to discuss. And as Duff Gordon talks about these labour that's done on her boat, and she describes these and the sort of commercial and social interactions that surround her possession of this boat and the work that needs to be done on it. And then, in the same paragraph as that last one, so in other words, this very prosaic discussion about the negotiations, she moves to commenting on Jamaica and on, of course, the uprising of enslaved plantation workers in Jamaica, and says, and in a way that seems to position her quite at contrary to much liberal thought on the so-called Eyre affair, I have little doubt Eyre did quite right. Even as at the same time that the rebels had enough of that sort of provocation, which I well know, to account for the outbreak. And this is a very strange passage, made all the stranger, and we've come back to some of our conversations about this, the decolonial responsibilities. As the phrase itself, the bit I've sort of elided here, is of course a racial slur, the N-word, deployed quite casually, and oddly enough in quite a sort of claim to a shared Enlightenment humanity. I know about the sort of provocation that might produce this sort of outbreak. But it's positioning there at the centre of the text. And I was going to run the whole quote and talk about that choice, but then I'd be here for another 5 to 10 minutes just on that, and that's a complicated conversation itself. What fascinates me about this passage is that Duff Gordon ends in her claim to the sort of Enlightenment humanism that Helen Wheatley sees in her work. Between the custom and education are the only real differences between one set of men and another. Their inner nature is the same all the world over. But in the context of the uprising in Jamaica, this rings to me rather hollow. You know, I'm not sure you can both sides the Eyre affair, as it were, that this assertion of common humanity is all very well, but what it is in essence done is allow the violence of enslaved labour relations as she continue in the same way that she is in essence doing in her carefully constructed familial model on the boat and on the, as you said, on the slave children. So to say, I have little doubt Eyre did quite right, can in her mind exist with this claim of common humanity in ways that again rest on this illusion of labour. And I'm going to finally end by pointing out that some of her last writing is, of course, about the boat, which will remain in her husband's name, but will become an act of transferable property, in practice, the final gift to Omar. And as Lucie Duff Gordon speaks about her final journey, if I live till September, I will go up to Esna. It remains a sort of beautiful moment of melancholy. I will die among my own people. I would rather die among my own people. But yet again, the realities of mobility, transport, and motion remain elided in the aesthetics and this claim to this epistemological centrality of herself